My friend judged my sugar daddy until I told her parents about her side job. Bella and I were best friends since freshman year. When I started dating Richard last year, I was honest about the arrangement. He was 45, divorced, paid for my apartment and tuition. I wasn't ashamed. Degree without debt, he got company for events. We both knew what it was. Bella lost her mind, called me a prostitute, said I had no self-respect, was selling myself. Every hangout. Must be nice having someone pay for everything. When Richard bought me a laptop, wonder what you had to do for that. She'd introduce me as my friend with a sugar daddy. Asked loudly if daddy gave me drink money. Posted quotes about women who value themselves versus women who sell themselves. She held an intervention. Cried about my safety and mental health. Told guys I liked that I was taken by my sugar daddy. Asked Richard if he was shopping for a younger model after graduation. Months of this. She couldn't afford spring break because of her tutoring job. Made speeches about having to budget while some people just asked daddy for money. I offered to pay for her Miami trip. She said she'd rather die than third wheel my gross sugar baby vacation. Second night in Miami, upscale rooftop bar. I saw Bella, with a man at least 60, wearing lingerie as a dress, his hand on her thigh, feeding him oysters, really kissing him. They left together in a Bentley. I took photos. I investigated. Those weekend tutoring conferences. Designer bags from her aunt. The apartment parents helped with. All lies. Found him online. William, hotel owner. Instagram full of young women on yachts. Found Bella in photos from 8 months ago. 8 months of her doing this while destroying me for the same thing. I confronted her with photos. Her face went white. Not what it looks like. Family friend, discussing business. Finally admitted it. William paid for everything, apartment, car, clothes. But claimed difference was she actually cared about William while I was using Richard. After months of calling me a whore, acting morally superior, she said we were in the same situation. Begged me not to tell. Parents were religious, thought she was virgin, would disown her. I gave her one chance. Publicly apologize, admit her hypocrisy to our friends. She refused, said it would ruin her reputation. Her situation was different because of real feelings. So I messaged her parents on Facebook, Bible verse posting mom, deacon dad, sent photos from Miami, screenshots of William's Instagram with Bella on yachts, told them to ask where the money really came from. Next day, Bella called hysterical. Parents pulling her from school, moving her home, taking the car bought with dirty money, making her work at uncle's accounting firm, told entire church congregation to pray for their lost daughter. She said I'd ruined her life over petty revenge. But she had 8 months to stop judging me, 8 months to come clean. Instead, chose to be a lying hypocrite. Friend group found out when Bella disappeared from school. Some apologized for believing her lies. Others said I went too far. Bella's stuck in her hometown. Williams moved on to another college girl. I'm graduating debt-free next month. But last week, something strange happened. William messaged me on Instagram. We need to talk about Bella. I have nothing to say about her. She wasn't my only girl, and you weren't Richard's only one either. My blood went cold. What? Check your email. A link to a private folder. Photos from that Miami weekend, but not just of Bella with William. Photos of Richard with another girl. At the same hotel, different nights. Same weekend he was with me. The girl looked young, really young. Another message from William. Her name's Sophia. She's 17. Told Richard she was 21. You're lying. I'm not the one who should worry about lying. Richard's been rotating 3 girls for 2 years. You're the oldest. My hands shook. Why are you telling me this? Because Bella knew. She saw Richard with Sophia months ago. That's why she was so angry about your arrangement. She was trying to warn you without saying it directly. That's not... The intervention? The constant digs? She was hoping you'd leave him before you found out the hard way. Another email. Screenshots of text conversations between Bella and her mom from 6 months ago. I'm worried about my friend. Her older boyfriend is seeing someone underage, but she doesn't know. You have to tell her. I can't. She'll hate me. She thinks they're exclusive. My phone rang. Bella. I know William contacted you, she said quietly. You knew? This whole time? I tried to make you hate the arrangement enough to leave. I'm sorry. I should have just told you. Is she really 17? Long pause. 16. She lied to everyone. Does Richard know? He does now. Her parents found out yesterday. They're pressing charges. My phone buzzed. Text from Richard. We need to meet immediately. Don't talk to anyone. I stare at Richard's text demanding we meet immediately, my hands shaking so badly I can barely hold my phone. William's messages are still open on my laptop showing photos of Richard with Sophia, this girl who looks so young, and I feel sick realizing I've been part of something terrible without knowing it. My roommate Megan walks in and immediately asks what's wrong, because apparently I look like I'm about to pass out. I try to speak, but nothing comes out at first, just this weird choking sound. She drops her backpack and rushes over, putting her hand on my shoulder. I turn the laptop toward her without saying anything because I don't know how to explain this. She leans in close, squinting at the screen, and I watch her face change as she scrolls through William's messages. Her eyes get wider with each photo, each line of text. She looks at me and back at the screen twice before sitting down hard on the couch next to me. She asks if I knew about any of this, and I swear I didn't. But even as I say it, I'm wondering what I chose not to see because the money was too convenient. The apartment I'm sitting in right now, the laptop I'm looking at, my entire senior year without worrying about rent or books or food, all of it paid for by a man who was apparently seeing a teenager on the side. Megan scrolls back up to the photos of Sophia and zooms in on her face. She's wearing what looks like a high school hoodie in one picture, standing next to Richard outside some restaurant. In another, she's dressed up nice, but something about her posture, her smile, screams young in a way I didn't want to see before. Megan says we need to call her brother Dominic, who's a lawyer, before I respond to Richard or do anything else. I nod because I can't think straight, and having someone tell me what to do feels better than trying to figure this out myself. Megan pulls out her phone and steps into the kitchen, talking low and fast. I can hear pieces of the conversation, words like underage and evidence and immediately. She comes back 2 minutes later and says Dominic is leaving work right now. He'll be here in less than 2 hours. I ask what I'm supposed to do until then, and she says nothing. Absolutely nothing. Don't respond to Richard, don't call anyone, don't delete anything. Just sit here and wait. So I sit there staring at my phone with Richard's text still glowing on the screen. The words look different now, more threatening. We need to meet immediately. Don't talk to anyone. It sounds less like a request from someone I had an arrangement with and more like an order from someone who's scared. I wonder what he thinks I know, what he's worried I might say. Megan makes me tea even though I didn't ask for it and sits next to me without talking. The silence feels heavy but also kind of safe, like she's giving me space to process without making me explain anything yet. My phone buzzes twice with texts from Richard asking if I got his message, saying it's urgent. Megan reaches over and turns my phone face down on the coffee table. She says Dominic will know what to do, just hold on. I try to drink the tea, but my hands are still shaking and some of it spills on my jeans. The hot liquid seeps through the fabric, but I barely feel it. I keep thinking about all the times Richard asked about my friends, wanted to know who I hung out with, asked if any of them needed help with money or housing. I thought he was just being nice, maybe looking out for other students. Now I'm wondering if he was shopping. Dominic arrives exactly 90 minutes later wearing a suit with his tie loosened, looking tired but focused. He's older than Megan by maybe 6 years, with the same dark hair but more serious eyes. His first question is whether I've communicated with Richard since the text. I show him I haven't responded, and he says that's good. We need to figure out what Richard wants, and what my legal exposure might be before any contact happens. The word legal makes my stomach drop because I hadn't even thought about that angle. Dominic sits down across from me and opens his laptop, pulling up some kind of document. He explains that if Richard knew Sophia was underage, I could potentially be implicated just by association with him, which makes my stomach drop even further. He asks if I ever met Sophia or knew about her. I say no to both, which is true, but then I remember seeing Richard with a young-looking girl at the mall once. I mentioned it, and he said it was his friend's daughter. I believed him because why wouldn't I? Dominic writes this down and asks what else I remember about that day. I tell him it was maybe 4 months ago. The girl was looking at clothes in some store while Richard waited outside. He bought her a bag from the store after. I saw them walking out together. Dominic's jaw tightens and he writes more notes. He asks if I have any texts or emails where Richard mentioned other women or other arrangements. I pull up our message history and scroll through months of conversations. Most of it is boring stuff about dinner plans or when he'd stop by the apartment. But there are a few messages where he asked about my roommate situation, if Megan needed help with anything, if I had friends who were struggling financially. At the time, I thought he was being generous. Now it looks like something else entirely. We spend 3 hours going through everything. My arrangement with Richard, the timeline of when it started, what I knew and when, any communications that might be relevant. Dominic is professional, but I can see judgment in his eyes when he asks if I ever questioned why Richard preferred college students or if there were other girls. I admit I suspected I wasn't the only one, but I never asked because I didn't want to know, and saying it out loud makes me feel complicit and stupid. Dominic doesn't say I'm stupid, but he doesn't say I'm not either. He just keeps taking notes and asking more questions. Did Richard ever take me around other older men with young women? Yes, a few times. Business dinners where everyone seemed to have a girlfriend half their age. Did I think that was weird? Honestly, no, I thought it was just how rich divorced guys operated. Did Richard ever specifically say he preferred younger women? No, not in those words, but he'd make comments about women his age being too complicated or too demanding. I thought he meant emotionally mature. Now I'm realizing he meant he wanted someone he could control. Dominic asks about money. How much Richard gave me monthly. If it was cash or transfers. If there's a paper trail. I tell him it was transfers to my account. $1,500 a month plus he paid my rent and tuition directly. Dominic writes this all down and says this is actually good because it creates a clear record of the financial arrangement. I ask why that's good, and he says it establishes the nature of our relationship if this goes to court. The word court makes me feel sick again. Megan brings us more coffee and sandwiches that I can't eat. Dominic keeps asking questions. Did Richard ever ask me to lie about anything? Did he ever introduce me to anyone as something other than what I was? Did he ever ask me to recruit other girls? No to all of it. But now I'm wondering if that was just luck, or if he was more careful with me for some reason. Dominic closes his laptop and rubs his eyes. He advises me not to meet Richard alone and to record any conversation if I do talk to him. He explains that Richard might be trying to ensure my silence or get me to provide an alibi, and either way, I need to protect myself legally. Megan offers to come with me if I decide to meet Richard, but Dominic says that might make him suspicious and less likely to reveal his actual intentions. He says what we really need is for Richard to talk freely, to say something that shows what he knew about Sophia's age or what he's trying to hide now. Dominic pulls out his phone and shows me an app that records conversations while looking like the screen is off. He downloads it onto my phone and shows me how to use it. He says if I do meet with Richard, I need to let him talk. Ask questions that get him to explain things. Don't accuse him of anything directly. I ask what happens if Richard figures out I'm recording, and Dominic says we'll worry about that if it happens. But right now, getting his statement on record is more important than anything else. He asks if I'm willing to do this, and I say I don't know. The idea of sitting across from Richard and pretending everything is normal while secretly recording him makes me feel dirty. But then I think about Sophia, about what her parents must be going through, about how Richard used my financial need to control me for over a year. I tell Dominic I'll do it. He nods and says he'll be nearby when it happens, waiting in his car in case something goes wrong. Megan says she'll come too and wait with Dominic. I feel grateful and terrified at the same time. I finally respond to Richard's text saying we can meet at a public coffee shop tomorrow afternoon. His reply comes instantly saying no, it needs to be private, at the apartment he pays for. The demand in his tone is different from how he usually communicates with me, more controlling and urgent, which confirms Dominic's suspicion that Richard is worried about something specific. I show the text to Dominic and he says this is actually perfect, because the apartment is private enough that Richard might speak freely, but it's also a place where I should feel safe since it's my home. He asks if Richard has keys to the apartment. I say yes, he has a spare set. Dominic says I need to get those keys back before the meeting or change the locks. Megan immediately offers to call a locksmith and Dominic says do it now, get it done tonight. While Megan makes the call, I text Richard back saying okay, tomorrow at 3 at the apartment. He responds with just okay, which is unusual because he normally writes longer messages with details about what we'll do after or where we'll go for dinner. The shortness of his response makes everything feel more real and more scary. The locksmith says he can come in an hour. Dominic stays with us until the locks are changed, going over again what I should and shouldn't say, how to position my phone so it picks up audio clearly, what to do if Richard gets aggressive or threatening. By the time Dominic leaves, it's almost midnight and I'm exhausted, but there's no way I'm sleeping tonight. That night I can't sleep because I'm replaying every interaction with Richard looking for signs I missed. The way he always wanted to know my class schedule, asking specific questions about what time I had breaks or when I'd be home. His interest in my younger friends, always offering to help if anyone needed anything, asking me to introduce him at parties or events. How he'd sometimes mention other students he'd mentored in the past, talking about them in this fond way that now seems creepy instead of kind. I feel stupid for not questioning why a successful divorced man in his 40s wanted to spend time with college girls instead of women his own age. Every excuse I made for him, every time I told myself it was just a mutually beneficial arrangement between adults, now sounds like lies I told myself because the money was too good to question. I get up around 2 and make more tea, standing in my kitchen that Richard pays for, looking at furniture Richard bought, wearing pajamas Richard's money purchased. Everything in this apartment is tainted now. Megan's door opens and she comes out in her robe asking if I'm okay. I say no, and she just nods and sits at the table with me. We don't talk, just sit there in the quiet dark until my phone rings and makes us both jump. Bella calls me at 2 in the morning and I almost don't answer, but something makes me pick up. Her voice is small and scared when she asks if William contacted me, and when I say yes, she starts crying. Not loud, dramatic crying, but this quiet, broken sound that makes my chest hurt. She asks what he told me, and I say everything, about Richard and Sophia and how Bella knew. There's a long pause where I can hear her breathing. She says she saw Richard with Sophia at a restaurant 6 months ago. The girl was in her school uniform, and when Bella tried to warn me indirectly, I got defensive and angry. I remember that conversation now. Bella had asked if I trusted Richard, if I knew what he did when I wasn't around, if I ever worried about who else he was seeing. I told her to mind her own business and stop judging my choices. She got quiet after that, and I thought I'd won the argument. Now I realize she was trying to help me, and I shut her down. I ask why she didn't just tell me directly, and she starts crying harder. She says she was terrified I'd expose her arrangement with William in retaliation, so she tried to make me hate the whole situation enough to leave on my own. All the judgment, the public comments, the intervention, it was her desperate attempt to push me away from Richard without revealing why. I'm angry and sad and confused because this recontextualizes everything, but it doesn't change that she let me destroy her life when she was actually trying to protect me. Bella explains that she couldn't just tell me directly because she was terrified I'd expose her arrangement with William in retaliation, so she tried to make me hate the whole situation enough to leave on my own. She says every time she called me a prostitute or made comments about my self-respect, she was hoping I'd get mad enough to break up with Richard just to prove her wrong. The intervention was supposed to scare me by talking about safety and older men taking advantage. Introducing me as her friend with a sugar daddy was meant to embarrass me into ending it. She thought if she made the arrangement look bad enough from the outside, I'd see it the way she saw it after witnessing Richard with that teenager. But instead, I just got defensive and dug in harder, convinced she was jealous or judgmental. Bella says she almost told me directly a dozen times, but every time she got close, she'd remember what I could do to her if I got angry. She'd think about her parents finding out, about being pulled from the school, about losing everything. So she kept trying indirect methods that just made me hate her instead. I tell her I understand, but I'm also furious because her fear of me meant I stayed with Richard for months longer than I might have. If she'd just trusted me with the truth, maybe I would have left before things got this bad. Maybe Sophia's parents would have found out sooner. Maybe Richard would already be in jail. Bella says she knows, and she's sorry, and she wishes she could go back and do everything different. We're both quiet for a long time, the weight of all our mistakes sitting between us through the phone line. I tell Bella about Sophia's real age and hear her gasp on the other end. She says when she saw them together, she thought the girl was just young-looking college freshman, not an actual teenager. She's crying harder now, saying she should have reported it to someone instead of trying to handle it indirectly. I tell her we both should have done a lot of things different, and now we're both stuck dealing with the consequences. She asks what I'm going to do about Richard's demand to meet. I tell her about Dominic's plan, about recording the conversation, about trying to get Richard to say something incriminating. Bella goes quiet for a minute and then asks if she can come with me. I almost laugh because 2 weeks ago I destroyed her entire life, and now she's offering to help me. But I also realize I need someone who understands these arrangements and their dynamics. Dominic said not to bring Megan because it would make Richard suspicious, but Bella showing up might actually work since he knows we were friends. I tell her I'll think about it and call her back in the morning. After we hang up, I sit there holding my phone, thinking about how everything got so twisted. Bella tried to save me by destroying our friendship. I tried to punish her by ruining her life. Richard tried to control us both by exploiting our need for money. William played messenger because he wanted to cause chaos or maybe clear his own conscience. And somewhere in all this mess is Sophia, a 16-year-old girl whose life got caught up in the same predatory system that trapped me and Bella. None of us made good choices, but some of us had way more power than others, and that matters. The next morning, I pick up my phone and stare at Bella's name in my contacts for a long time before I finally text her. She answers within seconds asking if I'm okay, and I tell her about Richard's message demanding we meet. There's a pause where I can see the 3 dots appearing and disappearing like she's typing and deleting over and over. Finally, her message comes through saying she wants to come with me, that she owes me this much after everything that happened. I almost laugh out loud sitting there on my bed because 2 weeks ago I sent those photos to her parents and destroyed her entire life, got her pulled out of school and stuck working at her uncle's accounting firm, while her church prayed for her soul. Now she's offering to walk into a meeting with Richard, who might be dangerous, might be desperate, might say or do anything to protect himself from criminal charges. But I also know she understands these arrangements in a way Megan never could, understands the power dynamics and the manipulation, and how men like Richard think. Dominic specifically said not to bring Megan because it would make Richard suspicious. But Bella showing up might actually work since he knows we were friends, and he might buy that we're working through our issues. I text back saying okay and asking if she's sure, and she responds immediately saying she's sure, that she should have been honest with me from the start instead of trying to manipulate me into leaving him. I tell her to meet me at my apartment tomorrow at 2 so we can go together. And she sends back a simple okay, followed by a heart emoji that makes my chest hurt, because we used to send those to each other constantly, and now it feels strange and careful. Megan comes home from class and finds me sitting on the couch staring at my phone. I tell her Bella's coming with me tomorrow and watch her face go through about 5 different expressions before she settles on concerned but supportive. She asks if I'm sure that's a good idea given everything between us, and I explain Dominic's reasoning about not making Richard suspicious, plus Bella actually understanding how these arrangements work. Megan nods slowly and says she gets it, but I need to be careful because Bella's in a vulnerable position right now, and Richard might try to use that against both of us. She's right, and I know it, but I also need someone there who won't make Richard immediately defensive. Megan helps me download a recording app on my phone that looks like it's turned off, shows me how to activate it without anyone noticing. We practice a few times until I can do it smoothly. Then she texts Dominic to let him know the plan changed. He calls within minutes, and I can hear the hesitation in his voice when he asks if I'm certain about bringing Bella. I explain my reasoning, and he's quiet for a long moment before saying, okay, but I need to be prepared for Richard to threaten Bella's situation with William if he feels cornered. Dominic spends the next hour coaching me on what not to say, how to avoid making statements that could implicate me in anything Richard did, how to deflect questions without seeming defensive. He tells me to let Richard talk as much as possible, that people usually incriminate themselves when they're nervous and trying to control a narrative. I take notes on my laptop even though my hands are shaking, writing down phrases to avoid and questions to redirect. When we finally hang up, it's almost midnight and I'm exhausted, but I know I won't sleep much tonight. The next day moves in this weird slow-motion way where I'm hyper-aware of every minute passing. I change clothes 3 times trying to find something that looks normal and not like I'm preparing for a confrontation. Megan makes me eat breakfast even though I feel sick, saying I need energy for whatever happens today. At 1:30, I'm pacing in the living room when my phone buzzes with a text from Bella saying she's outside. I grab my keys and phone, double-check the recording app is ready, and head downstairs. Bella's standing next to a beat-up Honda I don't recognize, wearing jeans and a plain sweater that look nothing like her usual style. The designer bags and expensive clothes are gone, replaced by Target basics that hang a little loose on her frame. She's lost weight since I last saw her, and not in a healthy way, her face thinner and her eyes tired. We look at each other for a long moment across the parking lot, and I see 2 weeks of consequences written all over her. I almost say I'm sorry right there, almost tell her I wish I'd done everything different, but she shakes her head slightly like she knows what I'm thinking. She walks over and gives me a quick hug that feels stiff and careful, then says we'll talk about us later, but right now we need to focus on keeping me safe from whatever Richard wants. I nod and we get in my car because I don't trust myself to be a passenger right now. I need to feel like I have some control, even if it's just over the steering wheel. The drive to the apartment takes 15 minutes and neither of us talks much. Bella stares out the window and I focus on the road, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what's about to happen. When we pull into the parking garage, I sit there for a minute with the engine off, trying to calm my racing heart. Bella reaches over and squeezes my hand once, a gesture that reminds me of who we used to be before everything got complicated and ruined. We walk to the elevator and ride up to the 3rd floor in silence, the building suddenly feeling unfamiliar even though I've lived here for a year. Every detail looks different now that I know what Richard really is, what I was really part of without understanding the full picture. The hallway leading to the apartment feels longer than usual, and my legs don't want to work right. Bella stays close beside me, and I'm grateful she's here, even though part of me knows this is completely insane. I knock on the door instead of using my key because this doesn't feel like my place anymore. Richard opens it almost immediately, like he was waiting right there, and seeing him makes my stomach drop. He looks older than I remember, stress written across his face in new lines around his eyes and mouth. His smile doesn't reach his eyes when he greets us, that polished charm he usually wears looking cracked and forced. His gaze moves to Bella, and I see surprise flicker across his face before he hides it, his expression smoothing into something more neutral. He steps back to let us in and offers drinks like this is a normal social visit, like we're here for dinner and conversation instead of whatever confrontation is about to unfold. The apartment that used to feel like a nice perk of our arrangement now feels like a trap, the walls too close and the air too thick. I decline the drink and so does Bella, both of us staying near the door instead of moving further into the living room. Richard notices and his smile gets tighter, but he gestures for us to sit on the couch. I perch on the edge of the cushion and Bella sits beside me, close enough that our shoulders touch. Richard settles into the armchair across from us, and for a few seconds nobody says anything. We just sit there in this horrible, tense silence. Richard breaks it by saying there's been a misunderstanding about Sophia, and he needs me to know his version before I hear distorted information from others. The word version makes my skin crawl because it implies there are multiple truths instead of just what actually happened. He starts explaining how Sophia approached him at a business conference, how she told him she was 21 and showed him a fake ID that looked completely legitimate. He describes her as aggressive in her pursuit, sending him messages and photos, making it clear what kind of arrangement she wanted. The way he tells it makes Sophia sound predatory and calculated, makes himself sound like a victim who was deceived by a manipulative girl. I sit there listening and feeling sicker with every word, because I can hear the manipulation in his tone, the careful way he's constructing this narrative. He's trying to get ahead of whatever the police told me, trying to plant his version in my head before I hear anything else. His hands move as he talks, gesturing for emphasis, and I notice they're shaking slightly. He's scared and trying to hide it behind this performance of innocent victim wrongly accused. Bella leans forward and interrupts to ask how many other girls there are besides me and Sophia. Richard's face hardens immediately, his jaw clenching and his eyes going cold. He says that's not relevant to the current situation, that we're here to discuss the misunderstanding with Sophia. But Bella presses forward, saying if he's going to claim Sophia deceived him, then we deserve to know if there's a pattern of young women supposedly lying to him. Her voice is steady, but I can feel her tension beside me, can see her hands gripping her knees. Richard stands up abruptly and the movement makes me flinch even though he doesn't come closer. He tells Bella this doesn't concern her, that she should leave, so we can discuss this privately. The dismissal in his tone is sharp and meant to intimidate, and I realize he's trying to separate us because Bella asking questions he doesn't want to answer. I find my voice and say Bella stays or I leave, surprised by how firm I sound when inside I'm terrified. Richard looks at me for a long moment and I watch him calculate his options, weighing whether pushing this will make things worse. Finally, he sits back down and his whole demeanor shifts, the hardness melting into something apologetic and concerned. He says he never meant to put me in an awkward position, and he values our arrangement too much to let outside problems affect it. The switch in tactics is so obvious it would be funny if it wasn't so manipulative, if I couldn't see exactly what he's doing. He continues saying Sophia's parents are overreacting to a situation they don't fully understand, that his lawyer will handle everything and clear up the confusion. Then he says he needs me to confirm that our relationship has always been appropriate and consensual if anyone asks me about it. The word appropriate hangs in the air and I want to laugh because nothing about this has been appropriate. Nothing about a 45-year-old man paying for a college student's life in exchange for companionship is appropriate even if it's technically legal. But I understand what he's really asking underneath the careful words. He wants me to provide cover for his pattern of pursuing young women, wants me to tell police and lawyers that our arrangement was completely normal and mutual. Dominic's warning echoes in my head about not making statements that could implicate me, about being careful with every word I say. I ask Richard directly what he expects me to say if police contact me, keeping my voice neutral. His expression shifts to something calculating and harder, the apologetic mask slipping for just a second. He says just tell the truth about our arrangement, nothing more, and the emphasis on nothing more is a clear instruction to limit what I reveal. Bella asks what truth he wants told, whether it's the truth that he specifically seeks out college students, or the truth that he pays for relationships with women young enough to be his daughters. Richard's jaw clenches again, and he turns his attention to Bella with obvious hostility. He tells her she's not in a position to judge anyone given her own situation with William, and the threat is implicit but completely clear. He knows about Bella's arrangement and he's willing to use it as leverage to shut her up. I realize in that moment that Richard probably knows everything, that men like him and William talk and share information about the girls they're involved with. The thought makes me feel violated in a new way, like I was evaluated and discussed by people I never even met. I stand up and say I need time to think about everything, needing to get out of this apartment before I say something that makes things worse. Richard's mask slips completely and he stands too, moving closer in a way that feels threatening even though he doesn't touch me. He reminds me that he pays for this apartment, my tuition for this final semester, my car insurance, and all of that could disappear if I'm not careful about what I say to people. The financial threat is explicit now. No more pretending this is a partnership or mutual arrangement. He's showing me exactly what this always was, his money buying my compliance and my silence. I understand now that our relationship was never about companionship or mutual benefit. It was always about his control and my dependence. He engineered it that way from the start, creating financial ties that would make it hard for me to leave or speak against him. Bella grabs my arm and pulls me toward the door, both of us moving quickly before Richard can say anything else. We practically run down the hallway to the elevator, and I'm shaking so hard I can barely press the button. The elevator doors closed, and Bella grabbed my phone, turning it off completely. She pulled me through the lobby and into the parking lot where my car sat under a streetlight. I fumbled with my keys and dropped them twice before she took them from my shaking hands. She got into the driver's seat, and I collapsed into the passenger side, my whole body trembling like I'd been standing in freezing water. We sat there in silence for maybe 5 minutes while I tried to make sense of what just happened. Richard threatened me. Actually threatened to take away my apartment and tuition if I didn't protect him from a criminal investigation about a 16-year-old girl. The man who bought me laptops and took me to nice restaurants just told me he'd destroy my life if I told the truth about him. Bella started the car but didn't put it in drive. She turned to look at me, and her expression was serious in a way I'd never seen before. She said we needed to go back to Dominic right now because what Richard just did was probably witness tampering or obstruction of justice or something illegal like that. I stared at her, my brain moving slowly through the shock. The recording. I'd recorded the whole conversation on my phone like Dominic told me to. That recording had Richard basically admitting he knew about other girls, threatening my finances, telling me to limit what I said to police. Bella drove fast through empty streets back to my apartment where Dominic was still waiting with Megan. I walked in holding my phone like it was evidence at a crime scene, which I guess it kind of was now. Dominic took one look at my face and knew something bad had happened. I played him the recording and watched his expression change as Richard's voice filled the room. He listened to the whole thing once, then played it again, stopping at certain parts to make notes on his legal pad. His jaw got tighter each time Richard's voice said something about controlling the narrative or protecting the arrangement. After the second listen, Dominic set down his pen and looked at me with this really serious lawyer face. He explained that Richard's statements about Sophia combined with the financial threats created a clear picture of someone trying to intimidate potential witnesses and control what they told investigators. He asked if I was willing to cooperate with any police investigation if they contacted me about Richard. The question hung in the air, and I realized this was the actual moment where everything changed. Up until now, I could pretend I was just a college student with a generous older boyfriend. But cooperating with police meant admitting what our arrangement really was, probably losing all the financial support Richard provided, maybe not being able to finish my last semester. It meant choosing between protecting myself and doing what was right about a 16-year-old girl who was probably scared and alone right now. I thought about Sophia, 16 years old, still in high school probably. Her parents just found out some 45-year-old man had been doing God knows what with their daughter. They were fighting for her against someone with money and lawyers and power. Meanwhile, I'd been living in an apartment Richard paid for, getting my tuition covered, going to nice restaurants, all while he was apparently grooming a teenager on the side. My debt-free education that I was so proud of suddenly felt dirty and wrong. I'd benefited from his money while he was doing something horrible to a kid. I told Dominic I'd cooperate fully with any investigation. I'd tell them everything about our arrangement, show them messages, give them the recording, whatever they needed. I said I'd accept whatever financial consequences came from that decision, even if it meant I couldn't finish my final semester. My voice shook when I said it, but I meant it. Dominic nodded and pulled out his phone to start making calls. He said he needed to find out which agency was handling the investigation into Richard, so we'd know who to contact. He stepped into the kitchen to make calls while Megan brought me water, and Bella sat next to me on the couch. I could hear Dominic's voice going back and forth with someone, asking questions about jurisdictions and case numbers and federal involvement. He came back 20 minutes later with information that made everything more complicated. There was a local police case about Sophia and her parents' complaint. But there was also a federal investigation that got started when someone reported a pattern of older men using money and power to exploit young women they met online. The feds were looking at multiple men, including Richard. And William's name had come up in the federal case, too. Bella went completely pale when Dominic said William's name. Her hands started shaking, and she asked in this small voice if she was in trouble. Dominic sat down across from us and explained that if she was over 18 when her arrangement with William started, she was probably considered a witness rather than a victim in legal terms. But she should still get her own lawyer to protect her interests. Bella laughed, but it sounded bitter and wrong. She said she couldn't afford a lawyer now that her parents had cut her off completely. She had maybe $200 to her name and no way to pay for legal help. I felt the weight of what I'd done to her settling on both of us like something heavy and suffocating. My revenge had destroyed her financial stability right before she might need a lawyer to navigate a federal investigation. Megan spoke up suddenly and offered to let Bella stay in our apartment's spare room temporarily. She said Bella was stuck in town anyway after leaving school, and she shouldn't have to figure out housing on top of everything else. It was awkward because Bella and I still hadn't really talked about what I did to her, about the photos I sent her parents or the way I'd blown up her entire life. But we were both caught in this bigger situation now that was way more serious than our friendship drama. Bella accepted Megan's offer quietly, and I watched her sitting there in clothes I didn't recognize, cheaper than what she used to wear. She'd lost weight in a way that didn't look healthy. The designer bags and confident attitude were gone, replaced by borrowed space and uncertainty about her future. 2 days later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. A detective named Floyd wanted to meet with me about Richard. Her voice was professional and calm, like she did this kind of thing every day. Dominic came with me to the police station, and we sat in a small interview room with gray walls and a table bolted to the floor. Detective Floyd was maybe 40 with short dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through any story you might want to tell. I gave her a statement about our arrangement, how it started, the timeline of our relationship, what I knew about other women Richard might have been seeing. I told her about the recording from our last conversation, and she listened to it twice, making notes the whole time. She was professional, but I could see her assessing me, trying to figure out if I was a victim who needed protection or a participant who knew what was happening. Honestly, I wasn't sure which one I was anymore. During the interview, Detective Floyd pulled out a folder with photos of 3 other young women. She spread them on the table and asked if I recognized any of them. I looked at the faces and felt sick. I recognized 2 of them from Richard's social media posts at various events over the past year. He'd always described them as friends or mentees, young women he was helping with their careers or education. I pointed them out, and Detective Floyd nodded like this confirmed something she already suspected. She explained that all 3 women were college students when their arrangements with Richard began. The police were trying to establish a pattern of predatory behavior targeting financially vulnerable young women, using money and support to create dependence and control. I asked about Sophia, and Detective Floyd's expression softened just slightly. She said Sophia's family discovered the relationship when they found expensive gifts and messages on her phone. Sophia had initially lied to her parents about her age too, claiming she was older, before finally breaking down and admitting everything, including her real age. The detective emphasized that regardless of what Sophia told Richard about her age, as an adult he had responsibility to verify it, especially given the huge age difference and power imbalance in their relationship. The interview lasted 3 hours, and by the end I felt exhausted and dirty in a way that went deeper than just being tired. Dominic drove me home and told me I did the right thing by being honest and cooperative. But I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd benefited from Richard's money while he was grooming a teenager at the same time. The debt-free education I was so proud of, the apartment I'd been living in, the nice dinners and gifts, all of it felt tainted now by association with his predatory pattern. I'd taken his money and told myself our arrangement was fine because we both knew what it was. But I'd been part of something much worse than I understood. That evening, my phone lit up with a text from Richard, and my stomach dropped before I even read it. He said he was disappointed I spoke to police without consulting him first, like I owed him some kind of warning before telling the truth about what I knew. The message kept going, saying the apartment lease ends in 2 weeks and he won't be renewing it, and my final tuition payment won't be processed either. I stared at the words and felt this weird mix of panic and relief because the financial retaliation was immediate and exactly what he threatened, but somehow seeing it actually happen felt less scary than I expected. At least now I knew where I stood instead of waiting for the other shoe to drop. I showed the text to Megan and watched her face get angry in a way I'd never seen before. Megan grabbed my phone and read the message twice before handing it back. She said I could stay in the apartment as long as I needed and we'd figure out rent together. Just like that. No hesitation or conditions attached. Her brother walked in right then, and she filled him in on Richard's text, and Dominic immediately started making notes on his phone about next steps. He said we should apply for emergency financial aid from the university to cover my final semester tuition, and he'd help me with the application tonight while everything was fresh. I felt this wave of gratitude mixed with shame because I'd been so proud of graduating debt-free, and now I had to admit to strangers that I'd been in a sugar baby arrangement that fell apart. Dominic pulled up the university website, and we started filling out forms right there at the kitchen table. The application asked me to explain my circumstances in an essay, and I had to write about Richard, our arrangement, why the funding suddenly disappeared. Every word felt like admitting I'd been stupid and naive, but Dominic kept saying to just state the facts without judgment. And I wrote about how I'd been receiving financial support that ended abruptly when I cooperated with a police investigation, keeping it vague enough to maintain some dignity. Megan read it over and said it was clear and honest, and we submitted it before I could overthink it more. Dominic said the financial aid office has apparently seen this situation before, which made me feel slightly less alone, but also sad that enough students had been in similar arrangements for the university to have a process for it. The next morning, Bella showed up at the apartment to help me pack. I hadn't asked her to come, but she texted saying she knew I had to move and she wanted to help, so I said okay because I didn't have the energy to argue. We worked in silence for a while, boxing up my clothes and books and all the stuff Richard's money had bought. Every item felt tainted now, like I should throw it all away and start over with nothing, but I couldn't afford to be that dramatic about it. Bella wrapped my dishes in newspaper and I packed my bathroom stuff, and neither of us talked about what was happening. Finally, she stopped and said she was sorry for not just telling me directly about seeing Richard with Sophia months ago. Her voice was quiet, and she didn't look at me while she said it, just kept folding a sweater she'd already folded twice. I put down the box I was holding and told her I was sorry for destroying her life, instead of just talking to her about what she'd seen. We both started crying then, standing in this apartment that Richard paid for, surrounded by half-packed boxes of a life that was falling apart. Bella said our friendship was broken in ways that can't be easily fixed, and I agreed, because how do you come back from what we did to each other? But we were stuck together in this mess anyway, both of us dealing with the aftermath of arrangements with men who turned out to be worse than we thought. We kept packing after that, passing tape and markers back and forth, and it felt like maybe we were building something new, even if it would never be what we had before. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. 2 days later, the university sent me an email about my financial aid application. I opened it expecting a long wait or more questions, but they'd already processed it and were offering me enough aid to cover my final semester tuition. The email said I'd graduate with about $15,000 in debt instead of nothing, which felt like a lot after spending a year planning to be debt-free. I called Dominic right away, and he congratulated me, then pointed out that $15,000 was manageable compared to what most students carry, and at least I'd have my degree. He was right, but I still felt stupid for not questioning Richard's generosity sooner, for not asking what it was really costing beyond the obvious. I tried to feel grateful because I could finish school and graduate on time, but mostly I felt like an idiot who'd taken the easy way, and was now paying for it in ways that went beyond money. My phone rang 3 days after I moved into Megan's place, and I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and it was Brooke from our old friend group. She said she'd heard Bella was back in town and wanted to know if we were okay, her voice careful, like she wasn't sure if asking was allowed. I met her for coffee that afternoon at a place near campus, and the moment I sat down, everything just spilled out. I told her about the revenge, about exposing Bella to her parents, about William's messages revealing Richard's relationship with Sophia. I explained Bella's actual motivation for judging me, how she'd been trying to warn me without saying it directly because she was scared I'd retaliate. Brooke listened without interrupting, just nodding and making these small sounds that showed she was following along. When I finally stopped talking, she was quiet for a minute, then said our whole friend group failed both of us by not questioning why older men were so interested in college students. She said everyone just accepted that Richard and William were generous benefactors, instead of asking why successful middle-aged men wanted to spend time with girls young enough to be their daughters. I'd never thought about it that way, how our friends had normalized something that should have raised red flags for everyone. Brooke stirred her coffee and said she wanted to help. She offered to organize a fundraiser for both me and Bella to help with our financial situations now that we'd lost our arrangements. I was touched but also immediately embarrassed at the idea of our friends knowing the full truth about what we'd been doing. Brooke must have seen it on my face because she said Richard and William were the ones who should be embarrassed, not us. But shame doesn't work that way. I couldn't shake the feeling that I should have known better, should have questioned why a 45-year-old man wanted to pay for my life. Brooke kept insisting it wasn't our fault, that we were targeted by men who knew exactly how to exploit financial vulnerability and youth, but I wasn't ready to let myself off the hook that easily. A week later, both Bella and I got calls from a federal investigator who wanted to interview us about the broader pattern of wealthy older men using financial leverage to pursue relationships with college students. The interview was scheduled at a government building downtown, and Bella and I drove there together, not talking much on the way. The investigator was a woman in her 40s who introduced herself and explained they were building a case about exploitation patterns. She asked detailed questions about how Richard and William approached us, what they offered, how the arrangements were structured. As we answered her questions separately, the investigator showed us documentation that revealed William and Richard were part of an informal network of men who shared information about arrangements and recommended young women to each other. I felt sick realizing I was potentially being evaluated to be passed along to Richard's friends like some kind of product. The investigator said they'd found online forums where these men discussed which college campuses had the most financially vulnerable students, which majors produced girls most likely to need money, how to structure arrangements to create maximum dependence. It was organized and calculated in a way that made our individual situations feel less like bad luck and more like we'd been hunted. Bella's interview revealed even more disturbing details. The investigator told me afterward that William had specifically targeted students with financial need and family pressure, knowing they'd be vulnerable to offers of financial support. He'd researched Bella before approaching her, knew about her religious parents and their expectations, understood exactly what buttons to push. The investigator explained this was a recognized pattern of exploitation that existed in a legal gray area, technically consensual but involving significant power imbalances and coercion. They were building a case focused on the men who pursued underage girls like Sophia, while also documenting the broader exploitation pattern affecting legal adults like me and Bella. The investigator said our cooperation was helping establish that Richard and William's behavior was predatory and systematic, not just unfortunate mistakes or misunderstandings. 3 weeks after my police interview, I was at work when my phone started exploding with notifications. I checked during my break and saw that Richard had been arrested and charged with multiple counts related to his relationship with Sophia. The news articles mentioned he was investigated for a pattern of financially coercive relationships with young women, and apparently someone had leaked my name because people were messaging me asking if I was one of the victims. Some messages were supportive, friends saying they were sorry I'd been manipulated and offering help. But others were judgmental, asking how I could have been so naive or suggesting I was partly responsible for what happened to Sophia. Man, one message said I should have known something was wrong and reported Richard sooner, like I'd knowingly let him hurt a teenager. I turned my phone off and went back to work, but couldn't focus on anything except the messages saying this was somehow my fault. That night, I had a panic attack for the first time in my life. My chest got tight and I couldn't breathe right, and Megan had to talk me through it until I could function again. The next morning, I called the University Counseling Center and got an appointment for that afternoon because I couldn't handle this alone anymore. The counselor was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes that didn't judge when I explained everything. She listened to the whole story and then helped me understand the difference between being manipulated by someone with more power and resources versus being responsible for their criminal behavior. She said I could acknowledge I made choices I regret, while also recognizing I was targeted by someone who knew how to exploit financial vulnerability and young women's trust. The counselor explained that Richard's behavior with Sophia wasn't my fault or my responsibility to prevent, that he was an adult who made criminal choices regardless of what I knew or didn't know. She said the guilt I was feeling was normal, but I needed to separate my poor judgment about my own situation from his predatory behavior toward a minor. We scheduled weekly appointments because one session wasn't going to fix the mess in my head, but at least it was a start toward figuring out how to live with what happened. I scheduled my first counseling appointment for the following week and left feeling like maybe I could get through this. The counselor's office was in a building near campus, and when I arrived early for my second session a few weeks later, I sat in the waiting room flipping through a magazine without actually seeing the words. The door opened and Bella walked in, freezing when she saw me sitting there. We stared at each other for a long moment before she took a seat 3 chairs away, her hands gripping her purse strap. Neither of us spoke. The silence felt heavy and uncomfortable, both of us pretending to look at our phones while hyper-aware of the other person's presence. When the counselor called my name, I stood quickly and followed her inside, feeling Bella's eyes on my back. After that, we kept running into each other in that waiting room, always awkward, always sitting as far apart as possible. One day, about a month into therapy, Bella arrived while I was still waiting, and she looked thinner, more tired than before. She sat down, and after a few minutes of silence, she quietly said her parents agreed to pay for therapy, but nothing else had changed. Still living at her uncle's house, still working at the accounting firm, still not allowed back to the school. She was saving every dollar from her job, hoping eventually she'd have enough to get her own place and maybe finish her degree somewhere else. I nodded, not sure what to say, and then my counselor opened the door and called me in. Dominic came over to the apartment a few days later with papers about the case. He spread them out on the kitchen table while Megan made coffee, explaining that Richard's lawyer was trying to work out a plea deal with prosecutors. But the prosecutors weren't interested in making it easy because of the pattern evidence they'd gathered and because of Sophia's age. Dominic said there would probably be a trial, and I might have to testify about our arrangement and the things Richard said about preferring college students. My stomach dropped at the thought of standing up in court and talking about everything while Richard sat there watching. Dominic must have seen my face go pale because he quickly added that my testimony could really help establish Richard's predatory pattern and his intent. He said the prosecutors needed to show this wasn't just one mistake, but a calculated pattern of behavior. I felt sick thinking about talking publicly about the apartment, the money, the whole arrangement that now felt so stupid and wrong. Dominic walked me through what kind of questions I might be asked, how to answer clearly and factually without getting defensive. But all I could think about was Richard's lawyers trying to make it seem like this was all my idea, like I'd pursued him instead of the other way around. Finals week arrived and I couldn't focus on anything. My textbook sat open on my desk, but the words just blurred together while my mind replayed conversations with Richard, with Bella, with the detective. I'd been a solid B student before all this happened, But this semester, my grades had crashed hard. I was barely maintaining the GPA I needed to graduate, which felt ironic since the whole point of the arrangement with Richard was to graduate debt-free and successful. Now I was graduating with debt and trauma instead. Megan noticed me staring at the same page of notes for 20 minutes and pulled the book away from me. She created a study schedule that broke everything into small chunks, made flashcards for my hardest class, and brought me food when I forgot to eat because my appetite had disappeared along with my concentration. Studying together in the apartment, Megan quizzing me on marketing concepts while making sure I drank water and took breaks, I realized what genuine friendship actually looked like. It wasn't transactional like what I had with Richard, where everything came with an unspoken price tag. It wasn't complicated like my friendship with Bella had been, full of judgment and secrets and manipulation. Megan just showed up and helped because she cared, expecting nothing in return except maybe that I'd do the same for her someday. Brooke texted me saying she wanted to organize a small gathering with our friend group, specifically to support me and Bella through everything happening. I almost said no, because the idea of sitting in a room with people who knew what I'd done and what had been done to me felt unbearable. But Megan encouraged me to go, said isolation would make everything worse, so I agreed. Brooke hosted at her apartment, and when I arrived, Bella was already there, sitting on the couch looking as uncomfortable as I felt. About 6 people from our old friend group showed up, and at first everyone just made awkward small talk and avoided eye contact. Then Brooke cleared her throat and said we needed to talk honestly about what happened and how we'd all missed signs of something bad. She facilitated the conversation carefully, asking questions about power dynamics and age gaps and financial control. It was uncomfortable at first, everyone knowing about my arrangement with Richard and Bella's situation with William, but Brooke kept pushing us to look at the bigger picture. How had we all normalized older men pursuing college students? Why hadn't anyone questioned Richard's interest in sponsoring a student? Several other friends quietly admitted they'd been in situations with older men that felt questionable looking back. Professors who paid too much attention, bosses who offered special mentoring, family friends who were too interested in their lives. I listened to these confessions and realized this pattern was way more common than anyone wanted to admit. We'd all been taught that older men's attention was flattering, that financial support was generous, that we should be grateful for their interest. Nobody had taught us to question why successful older men preferred young women they could control through money and power. My last final exam was for my hardest class, and I walked out of the testing room feeling completely numb. I was going to graduate. The registrar had confirmed I'd met all requirements despite my grades dropping this semester. But it didn't feel like the victory I'd imagined back when I first agreed to Richard's arrangement. Back then, I'd pictured walking across the stage debt-free, proud of how smart I'd been to secure funding without loans. Instead, I felt empty relief that this nightmare semester was ending, that I'd somehow survived despite everything falling apart. Megan picked me up outside the building and took me to dinner at a nice restaurant to celebrate finishing the semester. She ordered champagne even though we could barely afford it and made a toast to surviving. I tried to smile and act happy, but halfway through the meal I started crying and couldn't stop. Other diners were staring, but I couldn't control it. All the stress and fear and shame pouring out while Megan held my hand across the table. I didn't know how to feel about any of this anymore. Was I a victim or was I complicit? Had I been manipulated or had I made a stupid choice? The counselor said both things could be true, but my brain couldn't accept that complexity. 2 weeks after finals ended, Dominic called to say Richard's trial date was set for 2 months from now, which meant I'd have to come back to town to testify. The trial would happen after graduation, so I'd have my degree, but I'd need to return to face Richard in court. Dominic came over that evening to prepare me for what the defense lawyers would do. He explained they'd try to make it seem like the arrangement was my idea, that I'd pursued Richard for his money, that I was a willing participant who knew exactly what I was doing. They'd ask about how we met, whose idea the financial arrangement was, whether I'd been with other older men before Richard. Dominic said the key was to stick to facts and not get defensive when they tried to make me sound calculating or manipulative. Just answer the questions clearly and truthfully without letting them put words in my mouth. But I was terrified of being torn apart on the witness stand, while Richard sat there watching, probably looking respectable in an expensive suit, while his lawyers painted me as a gold digger. Dominic promised the prosecutors would prepare me thoroughly, and that he'd be there in the courtroom for support. Still, the idea of publicly describing my arrangement with Richard, of having every detail examined and judged, made me want to throw up. Bella called me one morning sounding nervous and asked if I'd do something for her. Her parents had finally agreed to meet with her after months of refusing all contact, and she wanted me to come along for support. I was surprised she'd ask me after everything I'd done to her, but she said I was the only person who really understood what she'd been through with William and her parents' reaction. We drove to her hometown together, 3 hours in my car with the radio filling the awkward silence between us. When we got there, I dropped her at her parents' house and went to wait at a coffee shop downtown. And 3 hours passed while I drank too much coffee and tried not to imagine what was being said in that house. Finally, Bella texted that she was done, and I picked her up from the curb. She looked completely exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She got in the car and sat quietly for a minute before telling me what happened. Her parents were willing to help her finish school eventually, maybe in a year or two, but she had to keep living with her uncle and following all their rules. No moving out, no contact with William, obviously, and mandatory church attendance every week. They wanted her to prove she was serious about changing her life before they'd invest in her education again. Bella sounded defeated, but also slightly hopeful, like at least there was a path forward even if it was long and controlled. Graduation day arrived hot and sunny, and my family drove in to watch me walk across the stage. My parents, my younger brother, and my grandmother all sitting in the auditorium while I lined up with the other graduates in our caps and gowns. They knew some of what had happened this year. I'd told them about Richard being arrested and that I'd have to testify, but I hadn't explained the full details of our arrangement or how much debt I was graduating with. My mom thought Richard had been a mentor who turned out to be predatory, which was technically true but missed the part where I'd agreed to the whole setup. When my name was called, I walked across the stage and was accepted my diploma, and I could hear my family cheering from somewhere in the crowd. Afterward, we took photos outside, and my mom hugged me tight, saying she was proud of me for finishing despite all the difficulties this year. I let myself feel proud too, even though this wasn't the debt-free graduation I'd planned, even though I was walking away with $15,000 in loans and trauma instead of the clean slate I'd imagined. Bella showed up at graduation even though she wasn't graduating herself, standing at the back of the crowd of families. I spotted her after the ceremony ended, and we looked at each other across the lawn. She walked over slowly, and we stood there for a moment before she said we needed to talk. We found a quiet spot away from the crowds and finally had the conversation we'd been avoiding for months. Bella said she forgave me for exposing her to her parents, but she'd never forget the feeling of her entire life being destroyed in one day. The panic when her phone started ringing, her mother crying, her father's cold voice telling her to come home immediately. I said I understood if she couldn't fully forgive me, and that I'd always regret choosing revenge over just talking to her honestly. We both cried a little, standing there in our graduation area while families celebrated around us. Bella said our friendship was permanently changed, that we'd never be as close as we were before because too much damage had been done. But she wanted to try to rebuild something different, maybe not best friends, but people who understood each other and could offer support when needed. I agreed that was probably the best we could hope for. I started applying for jobs the week after graduation, updating my resume and writing cover letters. The hardest part was figuring out what to say about the gap where Richard's supposed internship had been listed. I'd put it on my resume originally because it sounded impressive, working for a successful businessman in his consulting firm. But now that Richard was arrested and facing trial, I couldn't exactly use him as a reference or explain what that job actually entailed. Dominic advised being vague about why that position ended and focusing instead on my actual skills and education. So I removed the internship entirely and emphasized my coursework and the part-time job I'd had before meeting Richard. I got several interviews over the next few weeks, phone screens and video calls with companies looking for entry-level marketing people. But none of them led to offers, and I started wondering if Richard's arrest had made enough news that employers were connecting me to the case. Maybe they Googled my name and found articles mentioning young women in financial arrangements with him. Maybe they saw my university and graduation year and put the pieces together. Or maybe I was just paranoid and the job market was competitive and I needed to be patient. I got the job offer on a Wednesday morning while sitting in Megan's apartment checking my email for the 100th time that week. The marketing firm wasn't fancy, just a small company that handled social media and advertising for local businesses, but they wanted me to start in 2 weeks, and the salary was enough to cover rent and start chipping away at my debt. I called Megan at work to tell her, and she screamed so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. That first paycheck 2 weeks later felt different from any money Richard ever gave me. It was smaller, way smaller, but when I deposited it, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Pride, maybe, or just relief that I'd earned this through actual work, instead of through being young and available to a man who turned out to be a predator. I bought groceries with my own money, and it sounds stupid, but I almost cried in the checkout line because nobody owned this. Nobody could take it away by threatening to cut me off. Bella called me a month after I started the job to tell me she got accepted to a different university 3 hours away from her hometown. Her parents agreed to help with tuition if she kept going to therapy, and followed a bunch of rules they set up. She had to live in the dorms instead of getting her own place, had to check in with them twice a week, had to keep her grades up and stay away from anyone who reminded them of William. She sounded frustrated when she told me about the restrictions, but also grateful, like she knew this was probably the best second chance she was going to get. We talked on the phone every few weeks after that, and the conversations got easier each time, though there was still this heaviness underneath everything we said. Some damage just doesn't fully heal no matter how much time passes or how hard you try to move past it. The trial date got set for late August, 2 months after graduation. Dominic helped me prepare for testifying, and we spent hours going over what the prosecutor would ask and what Richard's lawyer would probably try to make me say. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Jennifer Hutchinson, who specialized in cases involving exploitation and coercion. She met with me 3 times before the trial started and walked me through every detail of my arrangement with Richard, taking notes about the financial control and the way he'd structured everything to make me dependent on him. She told me Richard's lawyer would try to make it look like I pursued him for money, like I was some gold digger who knew exactly what I was doing. She said to stick to the facts about how he approached me at that networking event, how he slowly increased the financial support until I couldn't afford to leave, how he made comments about preferring college students because we were more fun and less demanding than women his age. I flew back to town the day before I had to testify and stayed with Megan again. That night, I couldn't sleep because I kept thinking about having to sit in that courtroom and talk about the most shameful year of my life while Richard watched from the defense table. Megan made me tea and sat with me until 3 in the morning, not saying much, just being there so I didn't have to be alone with my thoughts. The courthouse was smaller than I expected, older, with wooden benches that creaked when you sat down. Jennifer met me in a witness room before I had to go in and reminded me to breathe, to take my time answering questions, to look at the jury instead of at Richard. She said the defense would try to rattle me, but I just needed to tell the truth about what happened. Walking into that courtroom was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Richard sat at the defense table in a nice suit looking calm and confident, like this was just some minor inconvenience he'd get through. His lawyer was a man in his 50s with gray hair who smiled at me in this fake friendly way when I walked past. I got sworn in and sat down in the witness box, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edges of my chair to keep them still. Jennifer started with easy questions about my background, my major, when I met Richard. Then she moved into the arrangement itself, and I had to explain how he offered to help with my rent at first, then took over the whole apartment, then started paying my tuition. How he'd buy me clothes and jewelry and take me to expensive restaurants and events where he'd introduce me as his girlfriend, even though we both knew what it really was. How he told me multiple times that he preferred dating college students because we were more open-minded and less interested in marriage and kids. How he made jokes about getting a new model when I graduated, jokes that didn't seem threatening at the time but looking back clearly showed his pattern. Richard's lawyer took over for cross-examination and immediately started trying to twist everything I said. He asked if Richard ever forced me to do anything I didn't want to do, and I said no, but explained that financial coercion doesn't require physical force. He asked if I enjoyed the expensive gifts and trips, and I said yes at the time because I didn't understand what accepting them would cost me. He tried to suggest I sought out the arrangement deliberately by going to networking events where successful older men would be present, and I had to explain that I went to those events for legitimate career networking, not to find a sugar daddy. He showed emails where I thanked Richard for gifts and asked if he could help with certain expenses, trying to make it look like I was the one pursuing him for money. Jennifer objected several times when his questions got too aggressive, but I could see what he was doing, trying to paint me as a calculating gold digger instead of someone who got manipulated by a man with way more power and experience. The testimony lasted almost 3 hours, and by the end, I felt wrung out and exhausted. Jennifer asked a few follow-up questions to clarify things the defense had muddied. Then I was finally allowed to step down. I sat in the gallery for the rest of the day because I wanted to hear what came next. Sophia testified after lunch, and watching her walk to the witness stand made my stomach hurt. She looked so young, younger than her 16 years, wearing a plain dress her mom probably picked out. Her voice shook when she started talking, but she got stronger as she went on, describing how Richard approached her at a college fair she attended with her older sister. How he told her she seemed mature for her age and asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime. How he slowly built up the relationship over months, making her feel special and grown up, buying her gifts and taking her to nice places. How he told her not to tell her parents because they wouldn't understand their connection. How he isolated her from her friends who questioned why she was dating someone so much older. Jennifer asked Sophia about the fake ID she'd shown Richard, and Sophia started crying when she explained that he never actually asked to see it. She said she mentioned being in college and he just accepted it without asking for proof, without questioning why she looked so young or acted so inexperienced. She said now that she'd had time to think about it with her therapist, she realized Richard probably knew or at least suspected she was underage, but chose not to ask questions because then he'd have to stop seeing her. The defense lawyer tried to argue that Sophia deceived Richard deliberately, but Jennifer shut that down by pointing out that as the adult in the situation, Richard had a responsibility to verify her age, especially given the significant age gap and power difference. Sophia's testimony lasted 2 hours, and by the end, even some of the jury members looked upset. 3 other young women testified over the next 2 days about their arrangements with Richard. All of them were college students when they met him. All of them described similar patterns of initial generosity that gradually turned into financial dependence and control. One girl named Jessica talked about how Richard paid for her apartment, but kept the lease in his name so he could threaten to kick her out whenever she tried to set boundaries. Another girl named Amanda described how he'd show up at her campus unannounced to check on her, how he wanted to know where she was and who she was with all the time. The third girl, Lauren, explained how Richard specifically sought out students with financial need, asking about their debt and family situations early in the relationship, so he knew exactly how to make himself essential to them. Jennifer built this clear picture of predatory intent and pattern, showing the jury that Richard's behavior with Sophia wasn't some one-time mistake, but part of a calculated system he'd developed over years. I felt validated listening to their testimonies because it confirmed I wasn't crazy or stupid for not seeing the signs sooner. Richard had this whole method worked out, this way of finding vulnerable young women and making us dependent on him while making it seem like we were the ones benefiting from the arrangement. But I also felt sad and kind of sick knowing there were so many of us, that while I thought I was special, or at least unique, he was running the same pattern with multiple girls at the same time. The defense tried to argue that these were all consensual adult relationships and that the women benefited financially from their arrangements with Richard, but Jennifer kept bringing it back to the power imbalance and the pattern of targeting young women specifically. She showed emails where Richard bragged to friends about his stable of college girls, messages where he discussed which universities had the best ratio of attractive students to wealthy older men looking for arrangements. The trial lasted a week, and the jury got the case on a Friday afternoon. They deliberated for 2 days, coming back Monday morning with a verdict. I sat in the gallery with Megan on one side and Bella on the other, because Bella had driven up for the verdict, even though she didn't have to testify. The jury foreman stood up and read guilty on multiple charges related to Sophia, including statutory rape and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Guilty on charges of financial coercion related to the rest of us. Not guilty on a few of the lesser charges, but guilty on enough that Richard's face went pale, and his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder to keep him in his seat. The judge set sentencing for a month later, and remanded Richard to custody until then. I watched the bailiff put handcuffs on him and lead him out of the courtroom and felt this weird mix of relief and emptiness. Relief that he was being held accountable. Emptiness because this didn't undo the year I spent in that arrangement, or erase my poor judgment in not questioning it sooner. Jennifer found us outside the courtroom and told us Richard would likely face significant prison time, given the conviction on the charges related to Sophia, and the pattern evidence from the rest of us. She said sentencing hearings would be in a month and we could give victim impact statements if we wanted. I said yes immediately because I wanted Richard to hear exactly how his financial control had affected my judgment and self-worth. Bella hugged me in the parking lot and we both cried a little. Not happy crying, but this exhausted, relieved crying that comes after something terrible finally ends. She had to drive back to her uncle's house that night, but she promised to come back for the sentencing hearing. A few weeks after the trial, I got contacted by advocates working on legislation to address financial coercion in relationships with significant power imbalances. The federal investigation into Richard and William had expanded to include several other men in similar patterns, and there was momentum building for new laws that would make this kind of exploitation easier to prosecute. And they wanted me and Bella to share our stories to support the policy changes, maybe testify before a state legislative committee. I told them I needed to think about it because the idea of making my story that public felt overwhelming. Bella felt the same way when I talked to her about it, scared of what her parents would think if she testified about her arrangement with William in some official government setting. I found a support group for people who'd been in financially coercive relationships through a flyer at the counseling center. The first meeting I attended was in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle, and I almost turned around and left because it felt too real admitting I needed this kind of help. But I stayed and listened to other people describe situations where money had been used to control them, and I heard my own experience reflected in their stories, even though the details were different. A woman my age talked about her ex who paid her rent, but tracked every purchase she made and threatened to evict her when she tried to leave. An older man described how his partner controlled all their finances and left him with nothing when the relationship ended. I shared my story about Richard in halting sentences, and when I said I still wasn't sure if I was a victim or just someone who made bad choices, the facilitator said those weren't opposite things. She explained that exploitation exists on a range, and I could acknowledge being harmed while also taking responsibility for my choices. That idea helped more than anything else because I'd been stuck trying to figure out if I was innocent or guilty when the truth was more complicated. And over the next few weeks, I kept going to meetings and started developing language to describe what happened that felt honest. I wasn't a pure victim because I entered the arrangement knowing what it was, but I also wasn't fully responsible because Richard had more power and experience and used that deliberately. The group helped me sit with that complexity instead of trying to force my experience into a simple category. 6 months after Richard's sentencing, Bella texted asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. We picked a place halfway between her new university and my apartment, neutral territory for both of us. She looked different when she walked in, healthier than the last time I'd seen her, wearing clothes that were nice but not designer expensive. We hugged awkwardly and ordered drinks and sat across from each other with too much unsaid between us. She told me about her new school and how she'd made friends who didn't know anything about William or her arrangement or why she'd transferred. I told her about my job and how I was paying down my debt faster than I expected. We talked carefully around the big things at first, discussing classes and roommates and weather. Then she said she was doing better, really better, and I said I was too. We both acknowledged that what happened between us was traumatic, but we didn't pretend our friendship was fixed, or that we could go back to how things were before. She said she still had nightmares about the night I exposed her to her parents, and I said I still felt sick thinking about how my revenge could have destroyed her future permanently. We agreed we'd both made terrible choices, and we'd both been manipulated by men who knew exactly what they were doing. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and we cried a little and laughed a little and left feeling like maybe we could build something new even if the old friendship was gone forever. A month after that coffee meeting, I got an email from an advocacy organization working on financial coercion issues. They were making a documentary about exploitation of college students and wanted to interview people who'd experienced relationships with significant power and wealth imbalances. I forwarded the email to Bella, and we talked on the phone about whether we wanted to participate. The idea of sharing our stories publicly felt scary, even though the documentary would use voice distortion and shadows to keep us anonymous. Bella worried her parents would somehow recognize her story, and I worried potential employers might connect the dots. But we both felt like maybe our experiences could help other students recognize exploitation before getting trapped in similar situations. We agreed to participate together, and the film crew came to interview us separately, but in the same session. And I sat in front of bright lights with my face in shadow and talked about how Richard targeted me specifically because I had financial need and was worried about student debt. I described how the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial at first, but gradually became controlling as I became more financially dependent. The interviewer asked good questions about the psychology of it, how Richard made me feel special and mature while actually exploiting my youth and inexperience. Bella's interview covered similar ground about William and how he specifically sought out students from religious families because he knew family pressure made them vulnerable. We both talked about how financial vulnerability made us targets for men who had done this before and knew exactly how to exploit that weakness. The documentary spent months in production and included our interviews alongside experts who explained the psychology of financial coercion. Psychologists discussed how significant age gaps combined with wealth disparities create power imbalances that make genuine consent complicated. Legal experts talked about how current laws struggle to address exploitation that's technically consensual, but involves manipulation and control. The documentary included interviews with other young women who'd been in similar arrangements, and seeing the pattern laid out made it clear this wasn't about individual bad choices, but about predatory men using a tested playbook. When the documentary finally aired on a streaming platform, it generated more discussion than I expected. Articles appeared analyzing the issues it raised about financial coercion and exploitation. University newspapers ran editorials about protecting vulnerable students. I watched it alone in my apartment and cried through most of it because seeing my experience contextualized within broader patterns of exploitation helped reduce the shame I'd been carrying. The documentary made it clear that Richard and William and men like them were the problem, not the young women they targeted. Comments online were mixed, some people saying we should have known better, and others saying the documentary opened their eyes to how manipulation works. But overall, it felt like our decision to participate had been right, because it was helping people understand these dynamics better. William's trial happened 9 months after Richard's, and Bella drove back to attend his sentencing hearing. She'd written an impact statement and practiced it with her therapist for weeks. I went with her for support and sat in the gallery while she stood in front of the judge and described how William's exploitation had damaged her relationship with her family and her sense of self-worth. Her voice shook, but she got through the whole statement, explaining how he'd specifically targeted her vulnerability about money and family pressure. She said his actions had cost her a year of school and nearly destroyed her relationship with her parents, and she was still working to rebuild trust with them. William's lawyer tried to argue that the relationship had been consensual and mutually beneficial, but the prosecutor presented evidence of William's pattern of pursuing college students with financial need. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in prison, similar to Richard's sentence, and specifically mentioned the predatory pattern as an aggravating factor. After the hearing, Bella's parents were waiting outside the courtroom. I hung back while they hugged her, and I saw her mom crying and her dad's hand on her shoulder. Bella told me later that having her parents there supporting her represented huge progress in their relationship. They were starting to understand she'd been manipulated rather than simply making immoral choices. She said she felt lighter after the sentencing, like she could finally close this chapter and move forward instead of being stuck in shame and regret. A year after graduation, my boss called me into her office and I thought I was in trouble for something. Instead, she told me I was getting promoted to senior account coordinator with a significant raise. I'd been working hard and bringing in good results, and the promotion felt earned in a way nothing Richard gave me ever had. The raise meant I could accelerate my debt repayment substantially. I sat down that night with my loan statements and calculator and figured out I could be debt-free within 2 years instead of the 10-year timeline I'd originally projected. The debt felt different now than it had right after Richard cut me off. It wasn't a shameful secret or a sign of failure. It was a manageable consequence of choices I'd made while being manipulated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I'd entered the arrangement with Richard to avoid debt, and I'd ended up with debt anyway. But I'd also ended up with a degree and a good job and hard-won wisdom about power and exploitation. And I was proud of earning my way out of the debt through honest work. Every payment I made felt like reclaiming something Richard had tried to take from me, proof that I could support myself without anyone's financial control. Bella graduated from her new university in the spring, and her whole family attended the ceremony. She sent me photos of herself in her cap and gown with her parents on either side, both of them smiling. Her mom looked proud despite everything that had happened, and her dad had his arm around her shoulders. Bella had gotten a job offer before graduation at an accounting firm where she'd interned, and she was moving into her own apartment in a new city. We celebrated together over video chat that night, and I felt genuinely happy for her success. She'd rebuilt her life after I destroyed it, and seeing her thrive made me grateful my revenge hadn't permanently derailed her future, even though it easily could have. She thanked me for being there through the trial and the documentary and the slow process of healing. I thanked her for trying to warn me about Richard, even when I wouldn't listen. We agreed we'd both learned painful lessons about trust and manipulation, and the importance of direct communication, even when it's uncomfortable. Brooke called me a few months later with news about our old university. The school was implementing new policies about financial aid and support for students in vulnerable situations, partly in response to the publicity around Richard's case. They'd created an emergency fund for students who needed to escape exploitative relationships, and they were expanding counseling services to include education about financial coercion and predatory relationships. Brooke said she'd been working with the student government to push for these changes, and our experience, as painful as it was, had helped protect other students from similar exploitation. The university was also requiring training for staff about recognizing signs of financial abuse and how to support students who came forward. I felt complicated emotions about this news, proud that something good had come from our situation, but sad that it had taken Richard's prosecution to make the school take these issues seriously. Brooke said several students had already used the emergency fund to leave bad situations, and the counseling center had seen increased requests for help with relationship issues involving money and control. I started dating someone I met through work about 18 months after Richard's arrest. His name was Garrison, and he was a designer at a partner agency, and our relationship developed slowly through project collaboration and coffee breaks, and eventually dinner dates. It felt completely different from my arrangement with Richard because it was built on genuine connection rather than financial transaction. But it was also awkward at first because I was hyper-aware of every power dynamic and financial imbalance. When Garrison paid for dinner, I worried about obligation and control. When he bought me a birthday present, I had to fight the urge to calculate its value and what it might mean. My therapist helped me work through these reactions and learn to recognize the difference between generosity and manipulation. Garrison knew about my past with Richard because the documentary had aired and my story was somewhat public. He didn't judge me for it, which helped me continue healing from the shame I'd carried. He understood when I needed to split bills evenly or when I got anxious about accepting gifts. We talked openly about money and expectations and boundaries, and that transparency felt revolutionary after the unspoken rules and financial control of my arrangement with Richard. Bella and I met in person for the first time in over a year and spent a weekend together in a city neither of us lived in. We rented a small apartment and spent 2 days talking honestly about everything that had happened between us. I told her about the moment I decided to expose her to her parents and how I'd felt justified and righteous and certain she deserved it. She told me about seeing Richard with Sophia and being terrified to tell me directly because she knew I'd think she was being hypocritical. We talked about my revenge and her attempted protection, and both of our poor choices and how we'd grown. We cried and laughed and argued a little and eventually agreed we'd never be as close as we were before because too much damage had been done. But we'd built a new friendship based on understanding and shared experience. It was different from our old friendship, more careful and less automatic, but it was real. We could talk honestly about the complicated feelings we both still carried. She could admit she still resented me sometimes for destroying her life, even though she understood why I'd done it. And I could admit I still felt guilty about not listening to her warnings, even though I hadn't known they were warnings. We agreed to keep working on this new friendship, to be honest with each other even when it was uncomfortable, to remember that we'd both survived something difficult and come out stronger. It wasn't the friendship we'd had freshman year, but it mattered. 2 years after Richard's sentencing, I logged into my student loan account and stared at the balance for a full minute. $0. The final payment had processed overnight and I was officially debt-free. I'd imagined this moment so many times during college, pictured myself celebrating with champagne and relief that I'd graduated without owing anything. But sitting at my desk in my small apartment that I paid for with my own salary, the feeling was completely different. I'd earned this through 2 years of careful budgeting and extra freelance projects and saying no to things I wanted. Every payment came from work I'd actually done, not from an arrangement with a man who turned out to be a predator. The achievement felt heavier than I'd expected, not triumphant, but quietly meaningful. Megan organized a small celebration that weekend with pizza and cake from the grocery store. She made a banner that said, "Debt-free and actually free," which made me cry a little because she understood what this really meant. Bella sent flowers to my office with a card that said she was proud of me, and I texted her a photo of my zero balance with 3 exclamation points. I was proud of myself too, not just for paying off the debt, but for choosing the harder path of accountability instead of protecting myself from consequences. I'm in a good place now with a stable job at the marketing firm where I got promoted last year, and a healthy relationship with Garrison, who knows my whole history and doesn't judge me for it. My friendships feel genuine instead of transactional, and I've learned more about power dynamics and exploitation than I ever wanted to know. The experience with Richard taught me awful lessons about vulnerability and how easily manipulation can look like generosity, but it also taught me about resilience and the possibility of recovery even when you've made terrible choices. Bella is thriving in her new city with her own accounting career and her own apartment that she pays for herself. We text regularly about normal things like work stress and dating and what shows we're watching, and we visit each other a few times a year. Our friendship will always be marked by what happened between us, by my revenge and her attempted protection, and both of our involvement with predatory men, but it's also been strengthened by how we both chose growth over bitterness. Richard is in prison serving his sentence, and Sophia is in therapy and doing better according to the victim advocate who occasionally updates us. The documentary we participated in has been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people, and we get messages sometimes from young women who recognize similar patterns in their own relationships and got out. The ending isn't perfect or neat because I still have moments of shame when I remember how easily I was accepted Richard's arrangement, and Bella still struggles with her family relationships even though they're slowly improving. We both carry scars from the experience that show up in unexpected ways, like how I get anxious when someone offers to pay for dinner, or how Bella freezes when she sees expensive cars. But we survived something that could have destroyed us completely. We grew into people who understand complicated truths about exploitation and choice, and we're using our experiences to help others recognize and escape similar traps. That's not the triumphant debt-free graduation I imagined when I was accepted Richard's first offer of help with tuition, but it's real and honest and ultimately more meaningful than the fantasy I was chasing. Life is messy and complicated and full of choices that seem clear until you're living with their consequences, but I'm finally okay with that uncertainty. Well, that's another top-tier episode of Life Falling Apart. If you're still watching, I'm impressed by your commitment to chaos. Subscribe, you've clearly earned it.